Different countries have an agenda to meet sustainable targets and reduce carbon emissions by a certain year based on their national policies. And with aviation being a carbon heavy sector, it's important to explore and understand how we can achieve sustainable air travel more efficiently. I'd like to introduce Roei Ganzarski, former CEO of MagniX. MagniX is the world's first all-electric commercial aircraft. Roei is also the former executive chairman of Eviation, the world's first all-electric middle-mile aircraft known as Alice. Roei will be sharing his insights on these aircrafts and on sustainable air travel. In 2019, flights produced approximately 915 million tons of CO2, accounting for about 2 to 3% of global carbon emissions. And between 1990 and 2012, carbon emissions from the airline industry grew by 75%, with projections indicating rapid growth until 2050. How is the aviation sector evolving, and when do you see a meaningful percentage of flights being fully sustainable?
I think it'll be decades before we see sustainable, real, meaningful flights. And the reason I say that is moving away from jet fuel, which is today the traditional or the only means of fueling aircraft, is the way aircraft are built. We've been trained very well by the aircraft manufacturers and by the airlines that operate these aircraft that it's the only way to fly. But it is today the majority of flights. I'm, for example, today in Washington, D.C., away from my hometown in Seattle. I flew here in a large jet, and it took about 4 hours to do so, with about another 100 people on board. That will take decades to turn electric of any type, be it hydrogen, be it battery, etc. What can be done is, for example, using some sort of synthetic fuel known as SAF, S-A-F, synthetic aviation fuel, that may be biodegradable, may be created from algae, etc., that is a little better for the environment. That's probably the closest and nearest term thing that we'll see in the next 10 years. We're already seeing some flights today happening. However, one thing to think about is, can we change the way we fly in order to enable more carbon clean aircraft? And to that, my argument has always been yes. For example, if I'm in Washington, D.C., and I want to fly to Philadelphia or to New York, those are very short flights. Or if I'm in Seattle and I want to fly to Pullman, Washington, a small town on the eastern side of the state where not a lot of people want to fly, there are still in these routes large jet aircraft that fly them. And they're very inefficient. These jet aircraft are phenomenal when it comes to high altitude cruise. So basically they take off, they burn a lot of fuel taking off. And when they burn a lot of fuel, they create a lot of emissions. Then they fly very efficiently at high altitude, kind of straight line flying across. And then they don't do much when they come to land, right? You're coming down on your own power. But when you do short routes, 100 miles, 200 miles, 400 miles, the majority of your time is spent climbing up, which means burning a lot of fuel and creating a lot of emissions. And then just a few minutes later, you hear the ding from the captain saying, we're about to start our descent, and then they descend. So that one portion of the flight, which is usually the longest, the cruise, which is the most efficient, doesn't happen in these short flights. Why don't we change the way we think about flying, change the paradigm of flying to say, if we're going to fly 100, 200, 300 miles, let's mandate that they be electric flights. And electric could be battery electric, could be hydrogen. There's all sorts of ways to do electric flights or zero emission flights, but let's mandate it. Let's have the government have the intestinal fortitude to say, we're going to require it. Because if the government requires it, guess what? The industry will meet it. The technology exists, the capabilities exist, the research exists. There's just no impetus to actually push it because the incumbents, the aircraft manufacturers and the airlines of today, are happy with the status quo. They may all say that they want zero emission, but they're not really acting on it because it's expensive. If we change the way we fly, small planes for small routes to and from small airports, that will completely change the way we fly, just like we change the way we drive. I have a large truck at home that I use to tow a boat or an RV or do a long family trip. It's gas-based. I also have a small electric car, which is my computer. And that's how I commute to work every day, with a small electric car. Now, at first, people would laugh at me, my friends, and say, oh, you'll never be able to take family trips with a small electric car. So that's right, that isn't the intent. The intent of the small electric car is to take me to work and back. The big car is to take me on long-range trips with the family. So same philosophy, same capabilities should be adopted to aviation, and there's really no reason they shouldn't.
It's amazing. I never thought about the idea of having um, sustainable uh, transportation for short distances, because that makes it more sustainable and more efficient. But what about long distances? Do you think we would become more sustainable for long distance travel?
I think we're looking at decades away, decades, 50, 60, 70 years. And the reason is the technology that exists today, the technology that we can envision existing today is so heavy and so cumbersome that a large aircraft doing Seattle to Washington, D.C., or Washington, D.C. to London, or London to New York is just too far out. It's not feasible. It's not logical to think about it because, again, the technologies that we can envision simply don't exist. Now, there are some options. For example, perhaps a hybrid aircraft is something we should look at. A jet engine that will do the efficient flight along range, but some sort of electric combination, again, be it batteries or hydrogen, that will allow or help the plane to take off, thus burning less emissions when doing that majority of the climb to altitude. Maybe that's an option. Again, synthetic fuels, if they are done correctly in the right way, can be a good thing. Although the creation of the synthetic fuel may be problematic, but that's a whole different conversation. But really for large aircraft, what today we would call jet aircraft or airliners flying 4, 5, 6, 15 hours, there's no thing in sight that will allow us to be zero emission.
Okay. Sustainable air fuels can reduce flight-related greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 80%. However, current production is about 1.5 million tons annually, far below the 24 million tons needed by 2030 to make progress toward net zero emissions by 2050. What sustainable fuels are we using in the aviation sector, and how can this be improved and implemented widely across nations? I know you mentioned algae, and I know that we have hydrogen and electric, but is there anything else that's being utilized at the moment?
So SAF, as a general term, sustainable aviation fuels, is really for things that replicate or mimic jet fuels. Basically, they're made of all sorts of different materials, one of them being algae, but there's a lot of different ways to create SAF. The challenge is it's very, very expensive. The last time I saw it, it's a couple times more expensive, or a few scales more expensive than regular jet fuel. So as much as airlines like to say that they're all environmentally friendly, they don't want to spend the extra money to actually be environmentally friendly. That's the difference, almost like a Seinfeld episode. We know how to do it, we just don't do it because it's expensive. And so that's one of the challenges with the industry, and in all industries, not just aviation, but in aviation more so, is that things are very expensive to do. And when people talk about the importance of it, they talk about it to the point of which they actually have to spend the money. And because there's no demand, then there's no production. Now, the airlines will have you believe because there's no production, there's no demand. But anyone who studies economics knows that demand and supply don't work like that. It's not that companies will go and create the sustainable aviation fuel and hope that someone buys it. No, you have to have a pull from the market to say, I want to buy it, and thus please make it. And if enough people demand it, the price will go down. Again, it's the basic economics of supply and demand. But right now, no one wants to spend the money. So the airlines are blaming the SAF manufacturers for not making enough. The SAF manufacturers are blaming the airlines for not demanding enough. And in the meantime, we continue to fly and create emissions worldwide. That's the fallacy of SAF. Until it gets to a point that either it's required, i.e. mandated by governments to do so, it will not happen. Because when it's mandated, demand will go up. When demand will go up, manufacturing will go up. It will be done at scale and prices will go down. This is where I believe the policymakers and the regulators of aerospace are failing us as passengers. Well, the one job that policymakers are supposed to do very well is set policy. They're not supposed to listen to industry lobby telling them why it's not a good idea. They're supposed to listen to why it's the right idea assuming of course it is, and reducing carbon emissions is of course, as we know, the right idea for all those who at least subscribe to or believe the notion of human-made, human-impacted climate change. And so to that end, policymakers should really look at what's feasible and then set policy, and the industry will follow. It's been done in the past. It's been done in states like California, et cetera, where governments had the guts, I'll say, to set certain policies, like when electric cars will be introduced, maybe electric trucks, all sorts of policies. And the industry found a way to answer the need. The best example I have is when electric cars started out, the state of California mandated that a percentage of cars sold by every manufacturer had to be electric. So you could buy electric cars in California that you couldn't in my home state, in Washington State. You couldn't get a Fiat 500 in Washington, but you could in California. You couldn't get a Mini Cooper electric in Washington State, but you could in California. Why? Because California mandated it and Washington State didn't. If the United States mandated it, if the UK mandated it, if the EU mandated it, the industry would find a way to meet that mandate and make it happen. But we're too afraid of our lobbies to say yes. And so we continue to research and discuss and talk. And in the meantime, create carbon emissions.
If you had to create a mandate for the US or the UK or the EU, what would it be? And how do you think we can implement it for the aviation sector to be more sustainable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would start with something bold. I would say any and all flights that are 500 miles or less must be zero emission. Start with that and see what happens. Now, France, for example, had a really nice ruling in the past few years where they said they will not allow flights under, I believe it was 400 miles or where train exists in order to try and cut emissions. The challenge is that the alternative is a train or a car, which isn't necessarily always much better. But they did take a move. I would suggest to governments to say anything under 500 miles that is flying must be zero emissions and see what happens. I believe that while we may not always get there in time, and I would say, by the way, with a timeline, for example, by 2035, in 10 years from now, why not? In 10 years, let's fly zero emission under 500 miles. Why not? There's a lot of people who will give you explanation on why not. Oh, we don't have the batteries. Oh, we don't have the motors. We don't have the planes. Yes, today we have batteries to fly people 100 miles, 200 miles, short trips, maybe 10 people, 20 people, not more than that. But that's today without any impetus from government, without any policy, without any mandates. That's just from the free market trying to create a change. Imagine what would happen if governments forced it and industry knew that they could make a lot of money doing these short flights because they would be the only option as opposed to a jet engine that could be driving an aircraft. That would change the paradigm into research, into the investments, into the thought process of what would it take to do it. And I believe we may not see it all by 2035, but we'll definitely see a step change. But we won't unless the governments make those bold statements and bold policies.
A really good answer and a really good point, actually. So MagniX is developing powerful and efficient electric propulsion solutions for commercial aerospace and defense. Can you please tell us more about this?
Yeah, so MagniX was created quite some time ago with the purpose of creating a powerful, very efficient electric propulsion systems that could work for larger aircraft. When I say larger aircraft, the majority of electric aircraft flying today are 2 passengers, maybe 4 passengers. The intent of MagniX was we wanted to enable larger commercial flights, those same flights of under 500 miles that actually did commercial routes, not people flying on the weekend or a flight school. Not that those aren't important, but we really wanted to focus on something a little bigger, 5 passengers, 12 passengers, 20 passengers, something that could actually fly people on these short routes from Seattle to Spokane, Olympia to Bellingham, small routes. Think London to Blackbush, Manchester to Blackpool, right? Short routes that people will want to fly that normally they drive, creating more traffic and emissions, and that flying is very bad from an environmental perspective. Those types of short routes may be very efficient. For example, really short routes in Scotland, where today driving takes you hours. but maybe an electric flight that could take 5, 10, 15 people over the land could provide really efficient but clean transportation modes. So that was the goal of the company. We created 2 different models of high energy density or powerful lightweight electric motors and started putting them into existing aircraft. The first one was a seaplane, a Beaver, together with an airline partner, Harbour Air in Vancouver, Canada. And we started flying that back in December of 2019, and it's still flying to this day. In fact, they have now orders for multiple of these aircraft converted to electric airplanes. We then went to a Cessna Caravan, a 12-passenger aircraft that could fly all electric. We then did the Alice, the 9-passenger plane that could fly all electric. Unfortunately, that company is going to stop operations here soon for various reasons, I believe unrelated to the technology, but that's a whole different story. But the goal is that drove more and more behavior in industry to start doing electric at a larger scale. And today, 2025, you see quite a few companies working on what we'll call standard-looking aircraft that will take off and land at an airport and fly electrically or even hybrid, but not on full jet fuel.
The MagniX also won a $75 million NASA contract. What was this for?
This was a bid that NASA put out for industry to actually prove that a large-scale hybrid aircraft could fly. 2 companies won that bid in parallel paths. GE was one, and MagniX was the other, which was a huge win as a small kind of startup company being able to win such a lucrative and important contract from NASA. That was a tremendous win. And what that is for is we selected the Dash 7 aircraft. It's an old 4-engine aircraft, which is very inefficient. But we're replacing, or MagniX is today replacing, 2 of the engines to be fully electric. So you'll have 2 traditional engines and 2 fully electric engines. And the idea is to prove that even 30, 40, 50 people can fly in a hybrid electric configuration. Again, remember what we talked about at the beginning, full electric for that size of aircraft is just not feasible. But hybrid electric is fantastic. Even if you cut 50% of the emissions, not 80, definitely not 100, but not 80, not even 75. Even if you cut 50% of the emissions of regional flights using a hybrid electric aircraft like that, a 30 to 50 passenger flight, you are making tremendous progress in reducing the human impact of climate change. And so really it's the thought process, what I always encourage people is, don't think about this as a 1 or 0 and all or nothing. Oh, until you can have a 777 aircraft be zero emission flying from LA to London, it isn't worth it. No, that's the wrong way to think about it. Incremental steps are important. Short ranges, all electric. Medium ranges, hybrid electric. And then long range, jet fuel, or more importantly, SAF. If we're able to, as an industry and as governments, drive towards that behavior, we will significantly impact emission creation by aviation, but we really have to do it. One example, which is always very disappointing, is when you see a bunch of really important people each fly in their private jet to a meeting to talk about how to reduce emissions and how to reduce fuel burn in aviation, when every one of them flew in a private jet, maybe 2 people to a jet that could normally carry maybe 20, 30, 100 people. Why not start there? Why should these wealthy and influential individuals not be the first to do this? Be the first to use your money for good and set an example. Create a hybrid aircraft, a all SAF flown aircraft, even an electric aircraft for flying your short routes, and show the world that it can be done.
Or even a rideshare jet, private jet. So they can...
Rideshare could work. There's a lot of complexities in rideshare itself, in the model and so on. If that could work, fantastic. Yes, do it. But the idea is, again, there you need a business to justify the rideshare, that there'll be enough people. And there are, by the way, examples. For example, Eviation and MagniX had orders for companies who are going to do those types of rideshares. But I'm talking even in the short term, companies or individuals can, in fact, today go all electric for very short routes. For small planes, they should do it. If for nothing else, to set the example that when they say it's important, they actually also do it. They can do hybrid long range flights or medium range flights. Do it so that you set the example. They can use SAF for long range. It's expensive, but they can. They should put their money where their mouth is, as they say, and fly that way. And policymakers should create policy to support it.
On March 2023, MagniX powered a first flight of the world's largest hydrogen fuel cell airplane. Could you please share more details about this event, the technicalities of the aircraft, and its impact on the aviation sector?
Yeah, that was with Universal Hydrogen. That was one of those companies based in California that had that audacious goal of creating a zero-emission regional aircraft. They used a turboprop aircraft. They had an ATR and a Dash 8, so two aircraft that you see today. They have two big propellers kind of on their wings, and today they fly regional, small, short routes inside Europe and inside the United States and all over the world. And their goal was to prove that you could go to zero emission, not by using battery electric propulsion, but by using hydrogen electric propulsion, meaning it's still electric, it's still zero emission, but instead of having batteries create the electricity or house the electricity for the electric motors, they were using hydrogen fuel cells to power the electric propulsion system. And they selected the MagniX propulsion systems to do it. And they achieved the goal, and they flew more than once with this thing, fully zero emission on a large scale aircraft. Unfortunately, they shut down because they couldn't get funding. Again, the fallacy of this industry is everyone talks a big game, as they say, about the importance of it. And yes, it's critical. And yes, we're all working towards it. But when actual companies do it, like Universal Hydrogen, no one's willing to back them, because I believe, as someone who is no longer in depth in the aviation industry, I'm allowed to say this out loud. I believe no one wants the change. The manufacturers of the large aircraft today, they don't want to change. They're happy with the jet aircraft that they sell because they're making a lot of money. The manufacturers of the jet engines, they don't want the change. They say they do, but they're happy with the jet engines that they sell and they make a lot of money off of them. The airlines that fly those jet engine powered aircraft have a whole infrastructure that's built around making a lot of money using jet engine aircraft. They don't want to change. So they all talk about the importance of change, but the most they're willing to do is use synthetic fuels instead of jet fuels. Oh, but wait, only if they're cheaper. And so they're not even willing to invest the money to do that. And so I believe the challenge is that the industry has not only no incentive to go green or clean, they have an internal incentive to maintain the status quo. They'll all tell you that's not true, but the facts on the ground, as they say, show that it is. And that's why I go back to saying it is up to policymakers, to our governments and regulators, to set policy, to set a reality that the airplane manufacturers, the engine manufacturers of today, and the airlines of today have no choice but to follow and meet the mandate. And then you will see a lot of change happen.
I'd like to see that happen as well. The Alice is Aviation's world's first all-electric commuter aircraft, operating at zero emissions with low operational costs and a sleek design for regional travel to transport passengers and goods. What design and technical features make Alice so unique?
Yeah, Alice was interesting because it was the first aircraft that was actually designed from the paper to become and be an all-electric aircraft. And what's the difference? If you look at what MagniX did in the early years, the E-Beaver, the float plane, the Caravan, the Dash 8 with Universal Hydrogen, the Robinson 44 helicopter, these were all existing aircraft that were designed around the efficiency of regular or traditional engines. Aircraft are designed around propulsion systems in order to take the most advantage of them and fly as efficiently as possible with propulsion. But all these aircraft were conversions. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but you're losing some efficiency because the aircraft was built around a big, heavy, gas-guzzling engine with fuel tanks, etc., and wasn't designed to take advantage of the efficiencies of electric aircraft. Eviation's Alice was the first such aircraft. It was an aircraft designed to be efficient with electric propulsion. Its body was part of the battery, or the battery was part of its body, as opposed to being a separate tank or a separate set of batteries installed. The entire bottom part of the airplane was its battery. The wings were much more narrow and sleek, like a glider, than you would see on a traditional aircraft, because that helped with the heavy aspect of the aircraft. It was heavy because batteries are heavy. And so having those glider-like wings made it very efficient. If you look at images, it had this kind of beautiful elongated dolphin nose that made it really aerodynamic. And so the Alice was really important and really exciting because it was an aircraft designed from the ground to be electric and flew super efficiently as well. In fact, when it did its maiden flight, it showed efficiency levels beyond what we expected to see when it was first being designed. And so that was a very exciting proposition, which kind of shows what long-term future might look like when companies don't think about conversions, but of actually creating something that is meant to be electric. You see the equivalence, by the way, in cars. The idea of electric cars has been around for a long, long time. In fact, some of the first cars in the world were electric, driven by batteries. It was very inefficient. The batteries were very inefficient. It was very dangerous, but it was done. The challenge was a lot of them were conversions. Take a regular car, convert it into an electric car. A lot of them were hobby cars. When Tesla came out and truly introduced a mass scale design-based electric car, meaning the car was designed to be electric, that changed the paradigm to say, if we actually do this from the beginning, not just convert an existing design, but design it to be electric from the beginning, that changes the way we think about electric cars. That changes the way things could be done in a car. Think of even the non-electric parts of it. When Tesla came out with their one screen, it was so radical. Where are all the gauges that you normally see in a car? The speedometer, the fuel, all the gauges, they were gone. There was one electric screen. Today, you see that on a lot of cars that even aren't electric, but new design cars that took that idea of a clean, Zen-like, efficient screen, digital, not analog. So even if that electric car itself didn't convert all car makers, a lot of the things that they brought in that were enabled by being electric suddenly took hold. I believe the same thing will happen in aviation. While not all companies will survive, I already talked about the fact that universal hydrogen is no longer, there was news just this week that aviation is going to be shut down because it didn't find additional investors. The same thing, not technology, money. And so I believe, though, a lot of the things that they have done will set the groundwork for future work that we'll see in aviation. And one day we'll look back and say, yeah, it started with a lot of these companies.
The challenge for a lot of companies could be keeping costs low when embarking on pioneering achievements that are sustainable. How did they manage to keep the costs down for this venture?
They didn't. The costs were very high. That's why they couldn't find investors at the end, or their current investor stopped investing in them. The challenge is revolutionizing something, anything, is expensive. If you're going to revolutionize cars, it's expensive. If you're going to revolutionize the way people shop for books, it's expensive. Look at Amazon. They lost money for years before the idea of buying online really became what today is normal. Who wants to even go to a store today? Just order it on Amazon or any online platform and it's there. Walmart has an online platform. All the companies who before were what are known as the brick and mortar suddenly all sell online because they found it to be super efficient. In the beginning, it was very expensive. Cars in the beginning were very expensive, and going into a zero emission aviation industry is very expensive. And aviation, even more than any other industry, is so expensive because of the safety regulations that come around it, right? If there's a problem with the car, pull to the side of the road, get out. If there's a problem with the plane, there's only one place that plane is going, and it doesn't end well. And unfortunately, we've seen that recently. And so the safety aspect of aviation makes it a very, very expensive proposition to begin with, and that's using traditional methods. When you're starting to introduce brand new research and brand new technology, it becomes even more so expensive. And so you really have to have, one, technology that allows you to do it. Two, financial backing that is patient, meaning they know that this will be a 10, 15, 20-year return and not what investors look for today, which is a 2 or 4 year return like they would get from some software company. And so it takes that combination of both long-term patient capital and technology, and of course a team that know what they're doing. You need that trifecta of things to happen in order for this to move forward. It will slowly but surely it will. We see today in the eVTOL, the electric vertical takeoff and landing, companies like Joby, like Archer, like Beta, really pushing the envelope because they have the technology, they have the people that know what they're doing, and they have patient capital that continues to invest in it. Now, will that solve all aspects? No, but it will solve an interesting proposition of perhaps replacing some of the very expensive and dangerous missions that gas-based helicopters do. Perhaps the eVTOL can provide some sort of replacement for some of those.
So fascinating. I love eVTOLs. I try to create one myself. What kind of partnerships are beneficial for sustainable aircraft companies, and which ones have you teamed up with on your net zero journey for MagniX and Eviation?
So I think any and all partnerships are good. Back in the day, we had partnership with some airlines, some operators like Harbor Air that had the guts and the vision to actually work on introducing an electric aircraft. We had a partnership, for example, with NASA that you mentioned. We want to contract and work closely and hand in hand with them to develop this brand new aircraft. We had a partnership with battery companies to provide batteries. One of them, for example, H55, a company out of Switzerland that does these very modular and very interesting battery packs that are very close to being certified as part of their propulsion system. But for example, those are batteries that are going to be on the eViver. And so you partner with anyone who's willing to and that has the ability to do it. We partnered with, at Aviation, we partnered with a company called Clay Lacy to basically introduce charging capabilities at their locations at the airports to charge the Alice when it comes in. DHL was the first customer of Aviation with cargo aircraft. And so you really partner with anyone who can add value to the overall ecosystem and the vision, because you're still discovering who the right partners are, what types of partnerships you need, and what they should look like, because there's no model for it. When you're first in the world to do something, you can't look to the sides and say, oh, I see that this type of partnerships works, let's do that, because it doesn't exist. And you can't use the blueprint of the existing aviation industry because we know it doesn't work for non-gas space, right? We can't do a partnership with Shell to have a lot of fuel being brought to airports. It's not relevant. We can't have a partnership with some of the companies that would work in traditional gas-based aviation because they're gas-based. They use fuel engines, etc. So you look for where are those visionary partners who can see the future and are willing to take the risk with you, because it's a risk, right? It's not certified yet, it doesn't exist, it's brand new. You find those partners that are willing to take the risk with you and be on the journey with you.
Amazing. Given energy density limitations, does battery electric aviation have a long-term future, or will hydrogen ultimately dominate?
I actually think we'll see a mix of solutions. I think we'll see battery electric doing very short flights. I think we'll see hydrogen doing medium term or medium range flights, even potentially as part of a hybrid solution. And then SAF, again, for the generations to come at least, will be the very long range aircraft. So I think we're going to see the best technology used for the best fit of the mission.
Are there specific airlines, governments, or companies doing the most to drive sustainable aviation forward?
Well, I would say the EU is the most vocal in their desire to move into sustainable fuel or to zero emission. But none of the countries, the US isn't, unfortunately, the EU isn't, the UK isn't, no one's actually really pushing this. A lot of putting in all sorts of grants to do some research and so on, but no one is actually setting policy. And it's only until you set policy that change will happen. Putting some money into grants and allowing companies to research the technology is interesting and it's good, but that's not what will create the change. Only policy setting will create the change. And unfortunately, no one is doing that yet.
Okay, thank you for that. That was really fascinating. I have one last question. If you could travel anywhere in the world with anyone you want, who would you go with? Which aircraft would you fly on? And what would be your ideal destination? And what activity would you be doing?
I would fly from Seattle to Pullman, Washington, where the Washington State University is. I would fly in an Alice all-electric aircraft with the Wright brothers, because I think they would be fascinated to see what their invention, their little 100-meter flight with the first powered aircraft, they were based in Dayton, Ohio, but flew in Kitty Hawk, what that thing led to less than 200 years later, which, if you think of it, isn't that a large an amount of time, but the range of where we've been and where we're going to is tremendous. So I think doing that flight would be really cool and really fun. And I think the conversations would be endless on that very short 45-minute, 200 plus mile all electric flight.
It sounds amazing. I'd like to join you all. Thank you so much, Roy, for this interview. I really
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
You guys have been fascinating.